Sir, this isn't a lawnmower. Please stay behind the line.
They told him to step back from the fence. A 77-year-old man in a faded denim jacket standing on the dirt shoulder of a county road in the July heat, watching a 68-ton M1 Abrams tank sit dead in the middle of a training field like a beached whale. 3 military mechanics had been crawling over it for the past 4 hours, radios crackling, officers pacing. A staff sergeant wiped grease from his forehead and muttered something about a full diagnostic, and this old man, quiet as stone, just stood there watching with his hands in his pockets. When he finally spoke up and said he might know what was wrong, a young corporal looked at him like he had offered to perform surgery with a butter knife. "Sir, this isn't a lawnmower," the corporal said. "Please stay behind the line." The old man nodded, said nothing, went back to watching. What nobody knew, what nobody could have known, was that before any of them were born, that old man had spent more hours inside an Abrams than most of them had spent inside a classroom. If this story moves you, take a moment to comment the word respect below, because what happened next proved that some things never leave your hands no matter how many years try to take them away. His name was Arthur Dalton, born in 1947 in a small farmhouse outside of Abilene, Kansas, to a mechanic father and a schoolteacher mother who believed that every problem in the world could be solved with patience and the right set of tools. Arthur grew up elbow deep in engines before he was old enough to drive. His father ran a small repair shop at the edge of town, the kind of place where farmers brought their tractors and truckers brought their rigs, and nobody left until the work was done. Arthur learned to listen to machines the way some people learn to listen to music. He could hear a misfire at idle, feel a timing issue through the vibration of a wrench, smell a coolant leak from 20 feet away. By the time he was 16, he could tear down and rebuild a flathead engine blindfolded. His father used to say that God gave some people perfect pitch and he gave Arthur perfect feel. The boy didn't just fix things, he understood them. Every bolt, every gasket, every wire had a reason and a rhythm, and Arthur could read that rhythm the way a conductor reads a score. It was a gift, and it was also a destiny, because in 1966, when the draft notice arrived in a plain white envelope, Arthur Dalton didn't run, and he didn't protest. He folded the letter, put it in his shirt pocket, kissed his mother on the forehead, and reported for duty 3 days later. He was 19 years old. Basic training at Fort Leonard Wood was a blur of mud and shouting and sleepless nights, but Arthur moved through it with the quiet efficiency of someone who had already spent his whole life working harder than anyone around him. He wasn't the fastest runner, he wasn't the loudest voice. But when something broke, when a generator failed or a transport truck wouldn't start or a field radio went dead, Arthur was the one they called. His commanding officers noticed. Within 6 months he was transferred into the Army's Armoured Vehicle Maintenance Program, and from there his trajectory changed forever. Arthur didn't just learn how to service tanks, he absorbed everything. He studied the mechanical and electrical systems of the M48 Patton, then the M60, then later the revolutionary M1 Abrams when it entered service in 1980. He became one of the most respected maintenance specialists in the entire 3rd Armoured Division. His service record read like a manual for excellence. 2 tours in Vietnam as a field mechanic attached to armoured cavalry units, where he kept aging M48 Pattons running in conditions that would have defeated most men. Jungle humidity that corroded wiring. Mud so thick it jammed turret rings. Supply lines so stretched that replacement parts arrived weeks late, if they arrived at all. Arthur improvised. He fabricated components from scrap metal. He taught younger mechanics tricks that weren't in any manual, because no manual had ever anticipated the conditions they were operating in. He saved machines that had been written off. He saved lives by keeping vehicles running when retreat wasn't an option. And through all of it, he never asked for recognition. He never complained. He just worked. After Vietnam, Arthur stayed in the Army. He moved through a series of postings, always in maintenance, always with armour. Fort Hood, Fort Knox. Germany during the Cold War, where he spent 3 years maintaining Abrams tanks along the Fulda Gap, preparing for a Soviet invasion that mercifully never came. He was there when the M1 Abrams first rolled off the assembly line and into active units, and he fell in love with the machine the way a pilot falls in love with a new aircraft. The Abrams was a masterpiece of engineering, a perfect marriage of firepower, protection, and mobility powered by a Honeywell A GT1500 gas turbine engine that produced 1,500 horsepower and could run on virtually any fuel. Arthur learned that engine inside and out. He could diagnose a turbine fault by the pitch of its whine. He could feel a transmission issue through the hull plating. He knew every access panel, every hydraulic line, every electrical relay. Other mechanics consulted manuals. Arthur consulted his memory, his hands, and his instincts, and he was almost never wrong. By the time Desert Storm arrived in 1991, Arthur was a master sergeant and the senior maintenance chief for an entire armoured battalion. His unit's readiness rate was the highest in the division. Not a single Abrams under his care was lost to mechanical failure during the 100-hour ground war. When the tanks rolled across the Iraqi desert at speeds that stunned the world, Arthur's machines ran flawlessly because Arthur had made them flawless. He retired in 1993 with 30 years of service, a Bronze Star, a Meritorious Service Medal, and the quiet gratitude of hundreds of soldiers who had served alongside him. No parades, no headlines, just a handshake from his commanding general and a drive back to Kansas in a used pickup truck. The years after retirement were kind at first, then less so. Arthur's wife, Margaret, passed away in 2008 after a long battle with cancer. They had been married for 36 years. She was the one person who had always understood him, who had waited through deployments and relocations without complaint, who had raised their 2 children largely on her own, while Arthur kept America's tanks running on the other side of the world. After she died, something in Arthur went quiet. He still lived in the small house they had bought together outside Junction City, Kansas, not far from Fort Riley. He still maintained a meticulous workshop in his garage, tools organized with military precision, workbenches clean enough to eat off. He still took walks. He still went to the VFW hall on Thursdays for coffee with other veterans. But the spark that had always driven him, that restless energy that made him the best at what he did, seemed to dim. His children lived far away. His grandchildren visited when they could, which wasn't often. Arthur became one of those quiet old men you see in small towns everywhere, walking slowly down the sidewalk in the early morning, sitting on a bench outside the hardware store, watching the world move on without him. He wore his old field jacket sometimes, the one with the faded 3rd Armoured Division patch, but he never talked about his service unless someone asked, and nobody ever asked anymore. He was just another old man in a small town, invisible in the way that old men become invisible when the world decides they have nothing left to offer. It was a Wednesday in July when Arthur drove out to the fence line along the eastern boundary of Fort Riley's training grounds. He did this sometimes, not out of nostalgia exactly, but out of habit, the way a retired sailor might drive to the coast just to watch the ships. The army had changed since his time, but the sounds were the same. The distant thud of artillery, the growl of diesel engines, the clatter of tracks on hardpack. On this particular morning, Arthur could see a company of Abrams tanks manoeuvring across the open training area, about 300 metres from the road. He parked his truck on the shoulder, lowered the tailgate, and sat there with a thermos of coffee, watching. The tanks moved in formation, kicking up dust that hung in the hot air like brown fog. Arthur watched with the practiced eye of a man who had spent decades reading the body language of armoured vehicles. He noticed things that civilians wouldn't. The way one tank's turret traversed slightly slower than the others. The faint blue tinge in another's exhaust that suggested a fuel mixture issue. Little things, mechanic things. Things that lived in his fingers and his ears and his bones even after all these years. Then it happened. The lead tank, a pristine M1 A2SEP, stopped moving. Not a tactical stop, not a planned halt. It simply died. The engine sound cut out with a cough that Arthur heard clearly even from 300 metres away, and the massive vehicle sat motionless in the middle of the field like a boulder. Arthur watched the crew scramble out of the hatches, watched the hand signals and the radio calls, watched the other tanks in the formation pull to a halt one by one. Within minutes, a pair of M88 recovery vehicles rolled up alongside the dead Abrams, and a team of mechanics in olive-drab coveralls swarmed over it like ants on a fallen log. Arthur sipped his coffee and watched. He could tell from their body language that they were confused. They were checking the obvious things first, the way young mechanics always did. Battery connections, fuel lines, the electronic diagnostic systems that modern vehicles relied on so heavily. Arthur could see them pulling out handheld diagnostic tablets, plugging into the tank's onboard computer system, scrolling through error codes. He watched this go on for about an hour before he finished his coffee, screwed the cap back on his thermos and walked closer to the fence. He stood there for another 2 hours, watching. The mechanics rotated in shifts. An officer arrived in a Humvee, and Arthur could see the sharp hand gestures that meant someone was getting chewed out. More diagnostic equipment was brought in. A satellite phone call was made. The tank sat there the whole time, inert, its turret slightly canted, its engine silent. Arthur could hear fragments of conversation carried by the wind, words like turbine fault and electronic relay and catastrophic failure. He heard a young specialist say they might need to tow it back to the motor pool for a full teardown. He heard a staff sergeant say that headquarters was going to have their hides if this tank wasn't running by the end of the day, because it was scheduled for a live-fire qualification the following morning. Arthur stood at the fence and listened and watched and said nothing for a long time. Then he waved his hand at a passing soldier, a corporal who was jogging toward the recovery site with a toolbox. The corporal stopped, looked at Arthur, saw an old man in a worn denim jacket, khaki pants and a ball cap with a faded American flag on it. The corporal was 23 years old, fresh out of advanced individual training, and he had exactly 8 months of experience working on armoured vehicles. He saw a civilian, an old civilian, probably a local farmer wondering what all the commotion was about. "Can I help you, sir?" the corporal asked, the way you might ask a lost tourist for directions. Arthur said, "I think I know what's wrong with your tank." The corporal blinked. Then he almost smiled, the way you almost smile when someone says something so absurd that you're not sure if they're joking. "Sir, this is a restricted training area. I appreciate the thought, but this is an M1 Abrams main battle tank. It's a little more complicated than what you might be used to." Arthur nodded slowly. "I know what it is," he said. "I spent 27 years keeping them running." The corporal's smile faded slightly, replaced by something between skepticism and mild annoyance. "Sir, I need to get back. If you have concerns, there's a public affairs office on post that can—" Arthur cut him off gently. "Your turbine didn't fail," he said, "and your electronics are fine. You've got a fuel control module that's stuck in a failsafe lockout, probably the solenoid valve on the fuel governor. It's a known issue on the AGT 1500 when ambient temperature exceeds 105 degrees. The onboard diagnostics won't catch it because the computer reads it as a turbine fault, but it's not. It's mechanical, a physical valve that's heat-seized." The corporal stared at him. "How would you—" "Because I've seen it before," Arthur said. "Desert Storm. 91. Same thing happened to 3 of my tanks in the same week when the ground temperature hit 130. Your manuals won't tell you about it because the technical bulletin was only distributed to units deployed to Southwest Asia, and it was never integrated into the standard maintenance doctrine. The fix takes about 8 minutes if you know where to look." The corporal stood there for a long moment, the toolbox heavy in his hand, the sun beating down on both of them. Something in the old man's voice, in the specific technical language he used, in the calm certainty of his words, made the corporal pause. He didn't go back to his task. Instead, he keyed his radio and called his team leader. The team leader, a sergeant first class named Rodriguez, came walking over with the impatient stride of a man who had been having a very bad day. Rodriguez was 34, a veteran of 2 deployments to Afghanistan and one of the better mechanics in the battalion. He had been working on the dead Abrams for 3.5 hours, and he was sweating through his uniform and running out of ideas. When the corporal explained that there was an old man at the fence who claimed to know what was wrong, Rodriguez almost turned around and walked away. But the corporal repeated what Arthur had said. The specific terms, the fuel control module, the solenoid valve, the heat seizure theory, the Desert Storm precedent. Rodriguez stopped walking. He turned and looked at Arthur through the fence. "Who are you?" Rodriguez asked. "Arthur Dalton," the old man said. "Retired Master Sergeant, 3rd Armoured Division. I was the Senior Maintenance Chief for 2nd Battalion, 67th Armour during Desert Storm." Rodriguez studied him for a long moment. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call. 15 minutes later, Arthur was escorted through the gate by a military police vehicle, signed in as an authorised visitor, and driven out to the dead tank in the back seat of a Humvee. The scene when he arrived was controlled chaos. 4 mechanics were still working on the Abrams, surrounded by diagnostic equipment, open access panels and scattered tools. A captain was standing nearby with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, talking on a satellite phone. When the Humvee stopped and Arthur climbed out, everyone paused. They saw a 77-year-old man, thin and slightly stooped, with weathered skin and white hair under a ball cap, stepping onto the training ground in civilian shoes. Nobody saluted. Nobody stood at attention. A few of the younger mechanics exchanged glances that said exactly what they were thinking. This is the guy who's supposed to fix a 68-ton main battle tank. The captain ended his phone call and walked over. "Master Sergeant Dalton?" he asked, using the rank Rodriguez had relayed. "Retired," Arthur said. "Yes, sir," the captain said. "I'm Captain Torres. I understand you might have some insight into our situation." Arthur looked past the captain at the tank. He studied it for a moment the way a doctor might study a patient. Then he said, "May I take a look?" Torres hesitated. There were regulations, liability concerns. The fact that a civilian, even a retired NCO, shouldn't be hands-on with active military equipment. But the tank had been dead for 4 hours, qualification firing was tomorrow, and the battalion commander had already called twice. Torres nodded. "Sergeant Rodriguez, escort Master Sergeant Dalton and give him whatever he needs." Arthur walked to the tank slowly, not because he was frail, but because he was reading it. Every mechanic who had ever been truly great at their job did the same thing. You don't rush to the problem, you observe, you listen. You let the machine tell you what's wrong before you start poking at it. Arthur circled the Abrams once, his eyes moving over the hull, the engine deck, the exhaust ports. He paused at the rear of the vehicle and placed his palm flat against the engine access panel. He held it there for a few seconds, feeling the residual heat, the faint vibrations of systems that were still powered, even though the turbine was down. Then he climbed up onto the rear deck. Rodriguez offered him a hand, but Arthur waved it off. His knees complained, his back protested, but his hands knew where every handhold was. He had climbed onto 1,000 Abrams tanks in his life, and his body remembered even if his joints didn't. He reached the engine compartment and looked down into the access bay that the mechanics had already opened. He didn't touch anything at first, he just looked. The 4 mechanics standing around the tank watched him with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed impatience. One of them, a specialist named Brennan, leaned over to Rodriguez and whispered, "Sarge, is this for real?" Rodriguez held up a hand. "Just watch," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure himself. Arthur studied the engine bay for about 90 seconds. Then he straightened up and said, "I need a 10mm wrench, a flathead screwdriver, and a can of compressed air. And if you have a heat gun, that would help, but it's not essential." Rodriguez handed him the tools. Arthur lowered himself into a position that made every young mechanic wince. Knees on the engine deck, upper body leaning into the compartment at an angle that couldn't have been comfortable for a man half his age. But his hands moved with absolute precision. He bypassed the electronic diagnostic panel entirely and went straight for a small access plate on the lower left side of the turbine housing that none of the mechanics had opened. He removed 4 bolts in under a minute. Behind the plate was the fuel control module, a compact assembly of valves and solenoids that regulated fuel flow to the turbine. Arthur examined it briefly, then reached in with the flathead screwdriver and applied careful, measured pressure to a small cylindrical component, the solenoid valve on the fuel governor. He worked it gently, back and forth, coaxing it free from where heat expansion had locked it in place. Then he hit it with the compressed air, blowing out debris and residual heat from the housing. The whole process took less than 5 minutes. He replaced the access plate, tightened the bolts, and climbed down from the tank with a grunt and a wince that he tried to hide. "Try it now," he said. Rodriguez looked at the captain. The captain looked at Arthur. Then Torres gave the signal to the tank's crew, who had been standing nearby the entire time, watching with the same wide-eyed disbelief as everyone else. The driver, a private first class who barely looked old enough to shave, climbed back into the hull and settled into his seat. He ran through the startup sequence, the auxiliary power unit hummed to life, then the main turbine began its characteristic high-pitched whine, building in frequency and intensity, filling the air with the unmistakable sound of 1,500 horsepower coming alive. The sound rose and then settled into a smooth, steady roar that shook the dust from the engine deck and sent a blast of hot exhaust across the training ground. The Abrams was running perfectly, running like it had never stopped. The silence that followed among the humans present was almost louder than the engine. Nobody spoke for what felt like a full minute. Then Rodriguez, who had been staring at Arthur with his mouth slightly open, said very quietly, "How?" Arthur wiped his hands on a rag that someone had handed him and said, "Experience." Captain Torres stepped forward and extended his hand. "Master Sergeant," he said, and there was something in his voice that went beyond professional courtesy, something closer to reverence. Arthur shook his hand. "Retired," he said again, but this time there was a small, tired smile on his face. The news travelled through the battalion like a brush fire. By that evening every soldier on post seemed to know the story of the old man at the fence, who fixed an Abrams in 8 minutes after the entire maintenance team had failed for 4 hours. The story grew in the telling, as soldier stories always do, but the core of it remained true and remarkable. A retired master sergeant, 77 years old, had walked out of obscurity and diagnosed a problem that the most advanced diagnostic equipment in the military inventory had missed. He had done it with his hands, his ears, and decades of accumulated knowledge that no computer could replicate. Word reached the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Hendricks, who called Captain Torres and asked for a full account. Torres provided one, and Hendricks said he wanted to meet Arthur Dalton personally. The meeting was arranged for the following day, and it was supposed to be brief. It turned out to be anything but. When Arthur arrived at the battalion headquarters the next morning, he was wearing the same denim jacket and bull cap. He hadn't expected much. Maybe a thank you and a handshake from another officer. Maybe a challenge coin, the military's standard currency of appreciation. What he found when he walked into the conference room was something else entirely. Lieutenant Colonel Hendricks was there, along with the battalion command sergeant major, Captain Torres, Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, and a full colonel that Arthur didn't recognize. The colonel was standing near the window with his hands behind his back, looking at something on his phone. When Arthur entered, the colonel turned around and his face went through a transformation that everyone in the room noticed. His eyes widened, his posture shifted. He stared at Arthur for a long beat, then said, "Artie Dalton." Arthur looked at the colonel, studied his face. Recognition came slowly, like light filtering through clouds. "Tommy Wheeler," he said. Colonel Thomas Wheeler, now the deputy commanding officer of the 1st Infantry Division, crossed the room in 4 strides and grabbed Arthur's hand with both of his own. "It's you," Wheeler said. "I don't believe it. It's really you." The room was very quiet. Arthur said, "You got tall, Tommy." Wheeler laughed, but his eyes were wet. The story came out in pieces over the next hour, told partly by Wheeler and partly by Arthur, who was more willing to talk than anyone had expected. Perhaps because for the first time in years, someone was asking. Colonel Wheeler had been a young second lieutenant in 1991, fresh out of West Point, assigned to 2nd Battalion, 67th Armour as a platoon leader. It was his first deployment, Desert Storm. He was 23 years old, terrified, trying to lead 4 tanks and 16 soldiers into combat for the first time. The battalion's senior maintenance chief was a master sergeant named Dalton, a quiet, intense man who seemed to live in the motor pool and who treated the battalion's Abrams tanks like they were his children. Wheeler remembered him vividly, not because of any single dramatic moment, but because of something that happened the night before the ground war began. Wheeler had been sitting alone in his command tank, unable to sleep, running through contingencies in his head, trying not to think about what the next morning would bring. Arthur had appeared at the tank's hull, knocked twice on the armour plate and climbed up to sit beside him. They didn't talk about the war. They didn't talk about strategy or logistics or the Republican Guard dug in somewhere in the darkness ahead. Arthur talked about engines. He talked about the sound a turbine makes when everything is right, when every system is in harmony, when the machine is doing exactly what it was built to do. He told the young lieutenant that the tanks were ready, that he had checked every one of them personally, that they would not fail, and then he said something that Wheeler had never forgotten. He said, "The machine won't let you down, Lieutenant. It's the same as the people around you. Take care of them, and they'll take care of you. That's the only secret there is." Wheeler went into combat the next morning with Arthur's words in his head, and he came through the other side. His platoon performed flawlessly. Not a single mechanical failure, not a single vehicle lost. He credited Arthur Dalton with giving him the confidence to lead that night, and he had carried that debt ever since. Now, 33 years later, standing in a battalion conference room at Fort Riley, Colonel Wheeler told that story to a room full of soldiers who had never heard of Arthur Dalton. He told them about the night before the ground war. He told them about the maintenance record that was the envy of the division. He told them about the 3 tanks with heat-seized fuel governors that Arthur had fixed in the Iraqi desert, while enemy artillery fell less than 2 kilometers away. He told them about a man who had given 30 years of his life to the United States Army and had walked away with nothing more than a handshake and a drive home. And then Wheeler did something that made Arthur's composure crack for the first time in anyone's memory. He turned to face Arthur directly, straightened to his full height, and snapped a salute. Not a casual salute, not a quick brush of the hand, a parade ground, textbook full honour salute to a retired non-commissioned officer from a full-bird colonel. In the Army, colonels do not salute master sergeants. The rank structure flows the other way. But Wheeler held that salute, rigid and precise, and said, "Master Sergeant Dalton, I have owed you this for 33 years. You made me the officer I am. You kept my soldiers alive. And yesterday, you proved that some things don't retire." Arthur stood there in his denim jacket and his faded ball cap, and for the first time in a very long time his eyes filled with tears. He didn't salute back. He was out of uniform, and his hands were shaking slightly, but he stood as straight as his 77-year-old spine would allow, and he nodded, and in that nod was everything. Every deployment, every midnight repair, every tank he had coaxed back to life, every soldier he had kept safe by keeping their machines running, every lonely year since Margaret died, every morning at the VFW hall where nobody asked about his service, every time he had driven out to that fence line to watch the tanks because it was the only way he could still feel connected to the life that had given him purpose. Lieutenant Colonel Hendricks stood from his chair and began to clap. Captain Torres followed, then Rodriguez, then the Command Sergeant Major, then everyone in the room. Arthur Dalton, retired Master Sergeant, stood in the centre of a standing ovation from active duty soldiers who had learned in the space of 24 hours what it had taken him a lifetime to build. Hendricks stepped forward and said that he was recommending Arthur for a Civilian Achievement Award from the Commanding General, and that he wanted to invite Arthur to serve as a volunteer technical advisor to the battalion's maintenance program. Not in any official capacity, but as a mentor, a resource, someone the young mechanics could learn from in ways that no manual or diagnostic computer could teach. Arthur looked at Hendricks and said, "I'd like that." And Rodriguez, the sergeant first class who had been the first to take Arthur seriously, walked over and shook his hand and said, "Master Sergeant, if it's all right with you, I'd like to be the first in line." The weeks that followed changed things at Fort Riley in small but measurable ways. Arthur began coming to the motor pool twice a week, always in his denim jacket, always with his thermos of coffee. He didn't lecture, he didn't grandstand. He did what he had always done. He watched, he listened. He waited until a young mechanic was stuck, and then he would walk over and say, "Mind if I take a look?" He taught them things that weren't in any technical manual. How to read the sound of a turbine for early warning signs. How to feel for heat stress in hydraulic lines with the back of your hand. How to improvise a temporary seal from materials you could find in any motor pool. He taught them the difference between fixing a problem and understanding a problem, between replacing a part and knowing why it failed. The younger soldiers were skeptical at first, the way young soldiers always are, but skepticism faded quickly when they saw Arthur diagnose a transmission issue by putting his ear against the hull, or when he predicted a filter failure 3 days before the diagnostic system flagged it, or when he showed a specialist a trick for aligning turret ring bearings that saved 4 hours of work. The skepticism was replaced by something deeper, respect. The kind of respect that can't be ordered or demanded but only earned, one quiet demonstration of mastery at a time. The corporal who had told Arthur to step back from the fence was named Davis. He was assigned to Rodriguez's maintenance team, and he dreaded the day Arthur would recognize him. When it happened, about 3 weeks into Arthur's volunteer work, it was nothing like what Davis expected. Arthur walked over to where Davis was struggling with a stubborn access panel, looked at the panel, looked at Davis and said, "You're the one from the fence." Davis felt his face go hot. "Yes, Master Sergeant, I'm sorry about—" Arthur held up a hand. "Don't apologize for doing your job," he said. "You were protecting a restricted area. That's what you're supposed to do." He paused. "Now, the reason that panel won't come off is because the 2 bottom bolts are reverse threaded. It's a design choice they made in the SEP variant. Counterintuitive, but it's there. Turn them the other way." Davis turned them the other way. The panel came off. He looked up at Arthur with an expression that was somewhere between gratitude and shame, and Arthur said, "We all learn. The only mistake is thinking you're done learning." Davis never forgot that moment. Years later, when he was a staff sergeant running his own maintenance team, he would tell younger soldiers the story of the old man at the fence, and he would always end with the same lesson. Don't assume you know who you're talking to. Don't assume you know everything. And never ever dismiss someone because they don't look like what you expect. Colonel Wheeler arranged for Arthur's story to be featured in the Post newspaper, and from there it spread to military social media, where it was shared thousands of times by veterans who recognized something in Arthur's story that mirrored their own experience. The quiet retirement, the feeling of being invisible, the knowledge and skills that don't disappear with age but are simply left unused because nobody thinks to ask. Arthur received letters from veterans across the country, men and women who had served in every branch, who had come home and faded into the background and wondered if anyone remembered what they had given. He read every one. He answered as many as he could in his careful, mechanical handwriting, always with the same message. You're not forgotten. What you know still matters, and if you ever get the chance to pass it on, take it. The last image anyone at Fort Riley would remember of Arthur Dalton from that summer was a Thursday evening in late August. The maintenance bay was mostly empty. The day shift had gone home. Rodriguez was doing final checks on a row of Abrams tanks that had just completed their annual service cycle. Arthur was sitting on an overturned crate near the bay door, thermos in hand, watching the sun go down over the motor pool. An old man in a denim jacket surrounded by machines he had loved his whole life, at peace in the one place where the world made sense to him. Rodriguez walked over and sat down beside him. They didn't talk for a while. Then Arthur said, "She sounds good, that number 3 tank. You fixed the turret traverse issue." Rodriguez nodded. "Used your trick with the bearing alignment." Arthur nodded back. "Good." They sat in the fading light, listening to the sounds of the post settling into evening, and in that silence was a kind of communion that needed no words. The old Master Sergeant and the young Sergeant First Class, separated by decades but connected by the same love of the same machines and the same duty. Arthur finished his coffee, stood slowly and said, "Same time next week?" Rodriguez stood too. "Same time next week, Master Sergeant." Arthur walked to his truck, climbed in, and drove out through the gate. The guard at the checkpoint waved him through without stopping him. Everyone on post knew his truck by now. Everyone on post knew who he was. And that, more than any medal or commendation or ceremony, was what mattered. Not fame, not glory, not vindication, though that had come in its own way. What mattered was being known, being remembered, being useful. Arthur Dalton had spent 30 years serving his country, and 30 more waiting quietly for someone to need him again. When the call finally came, it came the way it always had, in the form of a broken machine and a room full of people who had run out of answers. And he answered it the way he always had, with steady hands, a quiet voice, and the kind of knowledge that only a lifetime can teach. If you believe that experience never expires and that respect is owed not to appearances but to the substance of who a person truly is, then subscribe to this channel and share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. Because somewhere out there right now there is another Arthur Dalton standing on the other side of a fence waiting for someone to ask.